Darius had never known a world where his feet touched the ground. His life, from the moment he could remember, had been defined by the cold steel of his wheelchair and the rhythmic hum of its wheels. But that wasn't what bothered him the most. It wasn't even the stares he received as he rolled through the cracked sidewalks of the ghetto, the whispers of pity, the judgments in the eyes of people who couldn't understand. What bothered Darius the most was the feeling of being invisible. Not because people didn't see him, but because they only saw a broken boy. A boy who couldn't walk, couldn't run, couldn't stand on his own 2 feet and face the world like everyone else. In their eyes, he was weak, a burden, a reminder of the flaws in the world that nobody wanted to deal with. He lived in a place where everything had a price. A street corner could cost you your life if you weren't careful. The houses, shoddy, decaying shacks, spoke of a history of neglect, where families struggled to survive, and where violence wasn't just a thing that happened. It was part of the air you breathed. The sound of sirens was as familiar as the sound of the ice cream truck in better neighborhoods. But Darius wasn't just a part of the neighborhood. He was a ghost in it. People respected his father, the man who, despite the life he led, had earned the respect of everyone who dared to live on these streets. But they didn't see Darius the same way. He was too small, too young, too black, too broken, too black. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the jagged skyline as Darius wheeled himself down the street, past the rundown liquor store, past the group of boys playing basketball on the cracked pavement. They were laughing, shouting, their bodies moving with a freedom he couldn't know. It was a joke to them that he couldn't join in. His wheelchair had become part of the landscape, an unfortunate, helpless thing. But not today. Today, something felt different. There was tension in the air, a crackling unease. Darius couldn't put his finger on it, but he could feel it tugging at him, like a storm on the horizon. And then, as if on cue, the hum of the neighborhood was broken by the roar of a police siren. It wasn't unusual. Police came through here all the time, showing up in their black and white cruisers, making sure that the rest of the world could pretend they were doing their job. But today, something about it felt wrong. As Darius glanced over his shoulder, his eyes met the shiny, polished black cruiser that slid up to the curb. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his face stone cold, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. Darius froze. There was something about him, the way he stood, rigid and poised, like he was above it all. Like this neighborhood, these people, didn't matter to him at all. He was just doing his job, right? But the officer didn't stop at the corner. No, he walked straight toward Darius, his boots tapping on the pavement with an ominous rhythm. The others on the street fell silent, watching. A flicker of recognition passed through Darius's mind. The man was white. And in a neighborhood like this, that could mean only one thing: trouble. Darius's fingers tightened around the wheels of his chair. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. The officer was coming closer, and Darius was just sitting there, waiting for the inevitable. "You." The officer's voice was low, controlled, but there was a harsh edge to it. "Move it." For a second, Darius didn't understand. His mind couldn't process the words. Move it. What did he mean? The officer was standing right in front of him now, staring down at him like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "I said move," the officer repeated, this time louder. His hand reached out to grab the handles of Darius's wheelchair. Darius's heart raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was a deafening silence between them. And then the officer jerked the chair forward, pulling it roughly, as if Darius didn't have the right to sit where he was. "Hey!" Darius tried to shout, but the words got stuck in his throat. He struggled, gripping the arms of the chair as the officer yanked harder, trying to pull him away. He was thrown off balance, the metal wheels scraping against the ground. His body jolted with each movement, his skin tingling with fear. The officer didn't care. He was just doing his job. But Darius wasn't just some kid in a chair. He had his father's blood in him, and that was something the officer didn't know yet. The officer's hands were on Darius now, twisting the wheels of his chair as though it were nothing more than a toy, a thing to be discarded. His fingers dug into the cold steel as he shoved the wheelchair forward, with a brutality that made Darius's body jerk, his spine aching with every motion. He wasn't just being moved, he was being discarded, treated like an object, not a person. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, sharper than the metal scraping against the cracked pavement. The other kids on the corner watched in silence. There were no shouts, no protests, just a quiet, stunned sort of fear that radiated from the group. They'd seen this before, after all. But today was different. Darius could feel it. It wasn't just about the wheelchair. It was something bigger, something uglier. "Move it, cripple," the officer spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "We don't have all day." The words stung more than any physical pain Darius had ever felt. Cripple. That's what he was to them. That's what they saw when they looked at him. Nothing but a broken thing, a boy who couldn't walk, who couldn't fight back, a boy who didn't matter. Darius clenched his fists in his lap, his knuckles turning white, but he said nothing. His teeth ground against each other, his jaw locked. His father had always told him to keep his anger inside, to wait, to choose his moments wisely. But right now, in this moment, Darius didn't feel wise. He felt humiliated. He felt like a piece of garbage in a world that didn't care. The officer's hands jerked the wheelchair again, and Darius felt himself sliding dangerously to one side. He reached out instinctively, trying to stabilize himself, but his balance was off. The officer grinned, his expression twisted with something that resembled satisfaction. "Thought you could sit around here all day," the officer sneered. "No one's going to pity you. Not here. Not now." Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was tight, as if the words he needed to say were stuck somewhere deep inside him. But there was a fire in his chest, growing hotter by the second. He could feel the anger bubbling up, the injustice of it all clawing at him. He could feel his father's presence behind him, even though his father wasn't here. He could feel the weight of the promises his father had made, the lessons, the warnings, the expectations. "You're stronger than they think, son." His father's voice echoed in his mind. "People will try to break you. They'll make you feel small, worthless. But don't you let them. You are more than they can ever understand." The officer was still pushing him. Harder now, as though testing how far he could go before Darius would break. But Darius wasn't going to break. Not today. Not in front of these people. Not in front of the officer who thought he could strip away everything Darius was. Without warning, Darius threw his weight forward, throwing his hands out and slamming them against the officer's arm, pushing him away with a strength that shocked even him. The officer stumbled backward, thrown off guard. Darius's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no time to savor the victory. The officer's face twisted in rage. "You're a fucking idiot," the officer growled, his eyes narrowing. He reached for his baton, his fingers trembling with fury. Darius's mind raced. He could already feel the shift in the air, the way the atmosphere turned darker, heavier. The officer was going to escalate this, and there was nothing Darius could do to stop it. The only thing he could do now was survive. But just as the officer lunged forward, another voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Hey!" Darius's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice. It was a voice he hadn't heard in a while. A voice that carried the weight of 100 years of struggle. His father's voice. The officer froze, his baton hanging loosely in his hand. Darius's eyes flicked toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. Standing a few feet away, his father was there. The man everyone feared, the man whose name alone could stop even the toughest of men in their tracks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to make the very ground tremble beneath his feet. His face was carved with lines of hard-earned wisdom, but his eyes burned with something much deeper, something that could bring down the strongest walls. "Let him go." His father's voice was low, but laced with an undeniable power. The officer's hand tightened around the baton, but there was a hesitation now. Darius's father was a man with a reputation, a man who had seen the worst of the world and come out on top, a man who had lived through things that most people couldn't even imagine, and had made sure the people around him didn't forget it. The officer stood still for a moment, weighing his options. He could feel the weight of the gaze on him, the unspoken challenge in the air. But he was a cop, and he was trained to take control. And in his mind, this was still his beat, his territory. But as his eyes flicked from Darius to his father, the hesitation grew. "You're not welcome here," the officer muttered under his breath. But there was no fire behind the words, no conviction. Darius's father took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. "I said," he repeated, his voice now hard like stone. "Let him go." The officer seemed to shrink under the intensity of the stare, his hand slowly lowering the baton. The air between them crackled with unspoken history, with the weight of years spent battling an unjust system. The officer didn't know who he was dealing with, not really. He didn't know that every person in this neighborhood was a survivor, a soldier in a silent war. He didn't know that Darius's father wasn't just some guy you could push around. And that was the mistake. The officer finally took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously from Darius to his father. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His silence was all the answer Darius needed. Darius's chest heaved with a mixture of relief and rage. The officer had let him go, but it didn't change the fact that he had touched him, humiliated him, tried to break him. And the rage was still there, still simmering beneath the surface. "Get out of here," Darius's father growled, his voice now filled with disgust. "And don't come back." The officer turned, his face a mask of frustration, but he knew better than to argue. He was a cop in a neighborhood like this, where the rules were different, and the consequences were harsher than he could ever understand. Without another word, he climbed back into his cruiser and drove off, the tires screeching as they tore down the street. Darius stared after him, his heart still racing. His father walked up to him then, placing a hand on his shoulder, the weight of it grounding him. "You okay, son?" his father asked, his voice soft now, but the strength was still there. Darius nodded, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The words were too heavy, too complicated for him to say right now. His mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But one thing was clear. The officer had made a mistake that he would never forget. And so had Darius. They hadn't broken him, not yet. But there was a fire inside him now, a fire that would burn until everything was set right. And Darius would make sure that no one, no officer, no system, would ever try to break him again. The silence of the streets was almost unbearable as the police cruiser sped away, its engine roaring down the cracked road. Darius could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him. They'd witnessed the exchange, seen how the officer had pushed him, had nearly torn him from his chair, and then backed down when his father had shown up. But no one was talking. Not yet. Darius's father stood beside him, his presence as heavy as the air that clung to the humid evening. He wasn't looking at Darius now. He was scanning the horizon, his eyes sharp, like a wolf watching for danger. Darius could see the veins in his father's neck, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fists were clenched at his sides. "Dad," Darius said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. He was still shaken, still trying to grasp what had happened. His father turned to him, his face softening for just a moment. "You all right, son?" he asked again, his voice low and rough. It wasn't concern. It was something more, something that ran deep in the lines of his face. His father had fought battles before, had fought enemies who weren't just police officers in uniforms, but a system that sought to destroy everything he and his people had built. And today, that same system had reached out to hurt his son. Darius nodded, but he didn't feel all right. How could he? The officer's words, his actions, the way he had tried to tear him from his chair, it was all a reminder of how little his life seemed to matter to those in power. His father had saved him, yes, but he couldn't always be there. The world around them was brutal, unforgiving, and if Darius didn't start fighting back, if he didn't learn how to stand up for himself in a world that saw him as less than human, nothing would ever change. "You did good, son," his father said, his voice still rough, but there was a hint of pride now. You stood your ground. That's more than most people would have done. Darius didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was still reeling, still trying to process the humiliating encounter. He had been angry, yes, but had he really fought back because of the injustice? Or had he just been reacting to the shame? His father's gaze sharpened, reading the conflict in his son's eyes. "You're thinking too much about it," he said, his tone cutting through Darius's thoughts like a blade. "Don't let it eat you alive. This world's designed to make you feel small, to make you forget who you are. Don't let it. You're not a victim, Darius. Never forget that." The words should have been comforting, but they didn't reach Darius the way they should have. They didn't quiet the storm inside him. What had happened wasn't just about him. It wasn't just a personal insult. It was a symbol, a reminder of the world they lived in, the world his father had spent his entire life trying to survive. As they turned to leave, walking back toward their small apartment in the heart of the ghetto, Darius could hear the whispers around them. People were talking now, but not in the way he wanted. There was a heavy air of fear around them, as if the very act of standing up to authority in their neighborhood was an invitation for more trouble, and Darius could feel the weight of it. He wasn't just a kid in a wheelchair. He was the son of a man who had defied the world, and now the world would come for him. The next day, the tension was palpable. The neighborhood was on edge. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the street corners, to the shadows of the alleyways, as if waiting for something to explode. It wasn't just the usual fear of police presence. It was something darker, something more insidious. People knew what would happen next. It wasn't the first time a cop had gone too far in this neighborhood, and it wouldn't be the last. But what set this incident apart was the involvement of Darius's father. The ghetto was a place where things didn't change. People had learned to live with the brutality, the ignorance, the racism that seeped into every part of their lives. But when someone fought back, when someone made a stand, there was always a price to pay. As Darius wheeled down the street, his father walking beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whole world was watching. He could see the glances, the furtive looks of people who had learned to survive by keeping their heads down. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they knew the cost of standing up, the cost of resistance. "You all right, son?" his father asked again, his voice thick with concern. Darius nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. The officer's words from the day before still echoed in his head. The way he had said cripple. It wasn't just a word. It was a label. It was an insult, a dehumanizing marker of what society thought of him. But worse than that was the way the officer had seen him. Not as a person, not as a boy with dreams and hopes and fears, but as a thing. A body to be moved, to be controlled, to be put in his place. "Dad," Darius said, his voice low. "What happens now?" His father didn't answer immediately. They had reached the corner, the place where Darius's father often stopped to talk to the other men in the neighborhood. They had lived here for years, and in that time, his father had built relationships with almost everyone on this street. They all knew him, respected him. But Darius had seen the way they looked at his father too. There was a certain distance in their eyes, a wariness. His father was known for his wisdom, his strength, but he was also known for his temper. And the last thing anyone wanted was to get caught in the crossfire when his father decided it was time to make a stand. "This isn't just about you, son," his father finally said, his voice hardening. "This is about all of us who've been pushed down, who've been told we don't matter. You saw how they treated you yesterday. And you know it's not the first time. But the world has a way of making people forget, making people think it's just the way things are. And if you let them think that, if you let them think you're just a victim, you'll never get out. You'll never be more than they say you are." Darius nodded slowly. He understood what his father was saying, but the words didn't make the situation any easier to face. The world had already shown him who he was. At least, that was what it seemed like. It had shown him that he was nothing more than a black kid in a chair, someone who didn't fit the mold, someone who could be pushed aside. But his father was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been told they didn't matter, who had been thrown aside and ignored. It was about the people who had been silenced for far too long. As Darius wheeled himself down the street, he could feel the weight of his father's words settling on him. He had to fight back, yes. But how? How could he fight against something as deep as the racism that ran through the streets of his neighborhood? How could he fight against a system that didn't even see him as human? But then he remembered something his father had said before, something that stuck with him, even now. They won't break you, not unless you let them. The world will try to crush you, son, but you're stronger than they think. You are your father's son. Darius took a deep breath, the fire inside him igniting once more. He wasn't going to let them win. Not today. Not ever. The world had underestimated him, and now it was time to show them just how wrong they were. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life, or witnessed moments like this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated. Now, let's continue. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that the world was closing in on him. The streets that had once felt like a home, cracked sidewalks, peeling walls, and the dim hum of life on every corner, now seemed foreign. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the words the officer had thrown at him were seared into his mind. Cripple, the officer had called him. But it wasn't just the word that burned. It was what it represented. It was the idea that he didn't matter. That people like him didn't matter. As he wheeled himself down the block with his father beside him, Darius couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the air. People were whispering behind their hands. They weren't talking to him, but they didn't need to. Their eyes said everything. Fear, discomfort. They were scared of what might happen next. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but this time it was different. Darius's father had stepped in, and that wasn't something that went unnoticed. The man was a legend in their neighborhood, respected, feared, and revered for the things he had done. But no one was blind to the cost of that power. People didn't stand up to him. People didn't question him, and because of that, a strange sense of isolation crept in. The walls between Darius and the rest of the world were only growing taller. There was no escaping it. As they approached the corner where his father had stopped to talk to his friends the day before, Darius noticed the heavy silence that had descended over the area. Normally, there was laughter, music, the chatter of people exchanging gossip and news. But today, the streets felt like a battleground. Everyone was waiting to see if things would escalate, waiting to see how far the ripple of yesterday's confrontation would reach. Darius's father was the first to break the silence. "You know, son," he said, his voice steady but low. "You're not the only one with a target on your back." Darius glanced up at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. Most people don't see it, but they're all being watched. Every move, every step. This place, it might look like it's all run-down houses and empty storefronts, but it's more than that. It's a system that knows how to keep people in line. And when you stand out, when you make noise, they'll come for you. Darius's mind raced, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. He'd heard the rumors before, the whispers about the power his father held. He knew that his father had a way of getting what he wanted, but he didn't fully understand the price of that power. His father's influence wasn't something that came easily. It had been earned through years of sacrifice, through a willingness to fight when no one else would. But now Darius could see the cost. The world didn't care about them. Not the way it cared about other people. The world saw Darius as less than human, just as it saw his father, just as it saw the rest of the people who lived in this neighborhood. "You think you can change things?" Darius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think we can change anything?" His father paused, his expression unreadable as he looked out over the street. "I don't know if I can change anything, son, but I know I can make them listen. That's where we start. You don't need to fight for the world to change. You just need to make them see you." Darius didn't know if he understood that completely, but there was something about his father's words that stuck with him. His father didn't talk about hope. He didn't talk about dreams. He talked about survival. And survival meant standing your ground, even when the odds were stacked against you. As they moved further into the heart of the neighborhood, Darius could see the tension in the eyes of everyone they passed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something much more dangerous, uncertainty. No one knew what would happen next. No one knew if the fight between his father and the officer would lead to more violence, more trouble. They turned the corner, and Darius saw a group of kids standing in front of the local store, their faces tense, their eyes darting nervously to the street behind them. They weren't looking at Darius. They were looking at his father. And Darius could feel the weight of it. It was like every person in the neighborhood was waiting for a sign, waiting for his father to make the next move. The pressure was thick in the air, suffocating him. "You think you're the first one to fight back?" his father asked suddenly, his voice cutting through Darius's thoughts. He had stopped walking, his gaze fixed on the group of kids ahead. "You think that just because you've been wronged, you're the first one to feel that pain. Everyone in this neighborhood has felt it. Everyone knows what it's like to be pushed down, to be looked at like you're nothing. But it's not about how many times you get knocked down, Darius. It's about what you do after that." Darius looked up at him, meeting his father's steady gaze. "So, what do we do now?" he asked, his voice thick with the weight of the moment. His father didn't answer immediately. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the streets as if he were waiting for something. And then, finally, he spoke. "We fight." The next few days were a blur. News of the incident with the officer spread quickly, as things like that often did. But what made this time different was that people didn't just shake their heads and walk away. They watched. They waited. They knew that Darius's father wasn't a man who would let things go. There was a growing feeling in the neighborhood, something that hadn't been felt in years. It was a kind of quiet, simmering hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to accept the way things were. Maybe, if they stood together, if they fought for what was right, they could make a difference. But there was also fear. Fear that the price of standing up was too high. Fear that the violence that had shaped their lives for so long would return, more brutal than ever. Darius sat in his room late one night, his mind racing with everything his father had told him. There were things he didn't understand, things about survival, about power, about the world outside of this neighborhood. He didn't know how to fight back. He didn't know where to start. But he knew he couldn't do nothing. He couldn't sit back and wait for the world to change on its own. His father had always been the one who had taken the risks, who had made the sacrifices. But now it was his turn, and he wasn't going to let them take his dignity. Not anymore. As the night stretched on, Darius made a decision. He wasn't going to let the world define him. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him he was less than human. The fight was coming, and this time, he was going to be ready. But the next morning, Darius woke up to the sound of voices outside. He rolled to the window and peered out, his eyes narrowing as he saw a group of officers standing near the corner. They were talking in low voices, but the tension was palpable. They weren't just talking, they were waiting for something, and Darius knew, without a doubt, what that something was. It was time. He wheeled himself to the door and grabbed his jacket. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath and stepped outside. The fight was beginning, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. As he rolled down the street, his father's words echoed in his mind. "You don't need to fight for the world to change. You just need to make them see you." And that's exactly what he was going to do. The morning sun hung low over the streets, casting a grim light over the worn concrete of the neighborhood. It was a place that had long ago given up on promises, a place where broken dreams and shattered lives had been abandoned by society, left to rot in the heat of a world that seemed to forget it existed. But for Darius, today felt different. There was an electric charge in the air, something urgent, something fierce. It wasn't just the police presence that weighed on him. It was the sense that everything, all the hurt and humiliation he had carried in silence, was finally about to explode. His father's words rang in his ears, but they felt distant now. You don't need to fight for the world to change. You just need to make them see you. He wasn't sure if he was ready to make them see him. But if this was the only way, then maybe it was time. Maybe it was time for everyone to see him, to see all of them. His father, the people in the neighborhood, all those who had been cast aside, who had been told they didn't matter. He would make them see, even if it cost him everything. Darius rolled out of his small apartment, his wheelchair's wheels creaking as they turned on the cracked floor. The sounds of the neighborhood, the shouts of children, the hum of radios playing in the background, the distant sirens that seemed to be a constant presence, did little to comfort him. The day had barely begun, but already there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to wrap around every corner. As he made his way down the familiar streets, he could see the men standing near the corner store, their heads down, eyes watching the world through the thin veil of suspicion they had perfected over the years. They weren't looking at him, but they were watching. They were always watching, and they weren't the only ones. As he reached the intersection, Darius spotted the officers once again, 4 of them standing at the corner, their black uniforms sharp against the faded buildings. Their eyes tracked every person who passed by, every flicker of movement on the street. There was no mistaking the way they moved. Methodical, calculated, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for an excuse. It was the same way they had moved the day before when they confronted him. And Darius knew that they weren't going to leave. Not until they had made their point. The officers stood with an arrogance that was as old as the system that had shaped them. They wore the uniform of power, the uniform that said, "You're not welcome here and you never will be." But Darius didn't look away. He didn't turn back to hide in the safety of his apartment. He wheeled himself forward, each turn of the wheel a defiance of everything they wanted him to be. They wanted him invisible, insignificant. They wanted him to believe that he didn't matter, but he wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. The air around him felt thick, stifling. He could hear the whispers behind him, the low murmur of the people who had gathered, watching the scene unfold. Darius had always hated being the center of attention, but today it was different. Today, it wasn't about him. It was about something much bigger than his own discomfort. As he approached the officers, his heart began to race. He was close now, too close. And for a moment, doubt flickered in his chest. Was he ready for this? Was he really prepared to face them again, to stand tall against the very thing that had stripped him of his dignity, of his humanity? But then he remembered his father. He remembered the words, the strength in his father's eyes when he had spoken of the fight that would never end until it was over. He remembered how his father had made people see him, and he couldn't let that slip away now. The first officer spotted him, his eyes narrowing. There was no hesitation this time, no pretending to be polite. The officer's face twisted into something darker, something cold. His mouth opened, ready to speak, but Darius didn't give him the chance. "You'll have to do better than that," Darius said, his voice carrying a weight it had never had before. The officer froze, his hand twitching towards his baton, but Darius didn't flinch. The other officers slowly turned, their eyes meeting his. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, a tension that held everything in place. The world seemed to stop for just a moment, suspended in time. And in that moment, Darius realized something. They weren't just scared of him. They were scared of what his defiance represented. "I'm not going anywhere," Darius said, his words sharp, confident. He locked eyes with the officer who had spoken to him the day before, the one who had called him a cripple. He could see the flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes, the slight hesitation in his stance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The officer's mouth tightened, and he stepped forward. "You're making a mistake, boy," he said, his voice low, laced with the kind of contempt that only someone who thought they were above you could manage. Darius didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. He wasn't going to let them take his dignity again. "Don't call me that," Darius replied, his voice firm. "I'm not your boy. I'm not your nothing. I'm a person." The words hit harder than he expected. They carried more weight, more truth, than anything he had ever said before. And for a brief moment, the officer faltered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at his fellow officers, as if waiting for them to step in, to back him up. But the other officers didn't move. They were watching, their faces unreadable, their expressions guarded. They weren't sure what to do. They hadn't expected this. Darius's pulse quickened as the realization hit him. He had thrown them off. They weren't used to this, used to people like him standing up, used to people like him saying, "No more." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, another officer spoke up. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts," he muttered, his voice dripping with menace. "You won't be so cocky when we're done with you." Darius didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His father's words echoed in his mind, louder than ever. "It's not about how many times you get knocked down, son. It's about what you do after that." He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. But before the tension could escalate any further, the sound of tires screeching to a halt broke through the standoff. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh morning light. The officers turned their attention toward the vehicle, their faces betraying a mix of frustration and wariness. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall and imposing, dressed in a sharp suit. Darius's father. His father's presence was like a wave crashing over the street, knocking everything else aside. The officers straightened, their posture shifting from arrogance to uncertainty. "You've got a lot of nerve," Darius's father said, his voice cold, calm, but full of the kind of authority that made the air crackle with tension. The officers shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke. The silence stretched again, this time filled with the weight of his father's reputation, his power, and the knowledge that the officers were no longer in control of the situation. They were just men in uniforms, and in this moment, they weren't the ones calling the shots. "This kid," his father continued, his voice rising slightly, "is mine, and you don't get to treat him like that. Not here, not in my neighborhood." The words were simple, but they carried a power that none of the officers could ignore. It wasn't just about the threat of physical violence. It was about the weight of history, the weight of generations who had fought to survive in a system that had been stacked against them since the beginning. It was about the undeniable force of a father's love for his son and the lengths he would go to in order to protect him. The officers looked between each other, but they didn't say anything. They couldn't. Not with Darius's father standing there, with the whole neighborhood watching. And for the first time in a long time, Darius felt the fire inside him burn brighter. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had been overlooked, who had been cast aside, who had been told they didn't matter. And today, they were making the world see them. "Get in the car, son," his father said, his voice softening just enough for Darius to hear. Darius nodded. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a chance to make them see. And that was enough. As they drove away, Darius looked out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just a kid in a wheelchair anymore. He was a symbol, and he was going to make sure the world knew it. The car ride was eerily quiet. The hum of the engine, the soft thrum of the tires on the pavement, was the only sound in the air. Darius stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur by, but none of it felt familiar anymore. It was as though he had crossed an invisible line, a line that he hadn't realized was there until it had been crossed. His father sat beside him, his hands clasped in his lap, his face unreadable. Darius wanted to say something, to ask about what had just happened on the street, but the words felt stuck in his throat. His father had intervened in a way that was powerful and terrifying, but Darius didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know if he was supposed to be grateful, scared, or both. They passed the familiar houses, the rundown corners, the faces of the people who had become a part of Darius's life. But today, everything seemed different. The streets that had once been his home, the place where he had learned the hard lessons of survival, now felt like a cage. a cage that he couldn't escape. Darius's father hadn't spoken since the confrontation with the officers. He hadn't even glanced at him. The silence between them was growing heavier with each passing moment, suffocating Darius. He didn't know how to break it, but he needed answers. He needed to understand what his father was thinking, what this all meant. He needed to know where they stood and where this fight was going. "Dad," Darius said, his voice breaking the silence. "What happens now?" His father's gaze shifted slightly, just enough for Darius to catch the glint of his eyes. But he didn't respond immediately. His father had always been a man of few words, but this felt different. The quiet was unsettling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his father spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "What happens next is up to you." Darius turned his head sharply, confused. "What do you mean?" "I've been fighting this fight for a long time," his father continued, his gaze now focused out the windshield, his hands still. "I fought for my survival, for your survival. I've lived through things that should have broken me, and I've made sure you didn't have to face those same battles. But this fight, this one is yours." The weight of his father's words settled on Darius like a heavy blanket. He wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a burden. His father had always been the one who fought the battles, who faced down the world with a strength Darius couldn't comprehend. But now he was telling Darius that the next steps, the decisions, the consequences, all of it, was on him. "But I don't know how to fight, Dad," Darius said, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I fight something like this?" His father turned his head, his expression softening for the first time since they had left the street corner. "You fight it by making them see you. You fight it by showing them you're not afraid to be who you are. They want you to feel small, to feel less. You've got to remind them that you're not. You're not a victim, Darius, and you never will be." Darius looked out the window again, his mind racing. His father's words didn't feel like they were meant for him to understand now. They felt like something he would have to grow into, like something he could only comprehend after taking the first step. But what was that step? What could he do? He was just one kid in a chair, in a world that had already told him he didn't matter. The world had already stripped him of his dignity, called him weak, helpless. What could he possibly do to change that, to make them see him? The car slowed as they turned a corner, pulling into a parking lot. Darius looked up, confused. It wasn't their apartment building, but a large empty structure, a warehouse of some sort. Darius had never seen it before. His father pulled the car to a stop and turned off the engine. The silence between them stretched again, this time so thick Darius could almost touch it. His father was looking at him now, his eyes intense, focused. "Get out," his father said quietly. Darius blinked, still unsure of what was happening. "Where are we?" His father didn't answer immediately. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, his movements slow but deliberate. "I want to show you something." Darius hesitated for a moment before following his father out of the car. His legs were stiff from sitting so long, but his mind was still racing, trying to piece together what this all meant. They walked in silence toward the warehouse. As they approached the building, Darius noticed a few men standing by the entrance. They were all dressed similarly, casual but serious, their eyes focused, their postures tense. These were men Darius had seen around the neighborhood before, but he didn't know their names. "Dad, what's going on?" Darius asked again, this time with more urgency. His father stopped walking and turned to face him. "This is where it begins." Darius frowned. "What do you mean?" "This is where we fight," his father said, his voice firm. "This is where the real change starts, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be clean. The world doesn't care about us, Darius. It doesn't care about what happens to people like us, and it won't care until we make it." Darius felt a knot form in his stomach. His father wasn't just talking about standing up to the officers or to one person. He was talking about something bigger, something that would take more than words, more than just defiance. His father was talking about a battle that would ripple out far beyond the neighborhood, and that realization hit Darius like a freight train. His father was preparing him for war. The men by the entrance stepped forward as Darius and his father approached. They exchanged quiet greetings, nodding respectfully to his father before turning their attention to Darius. "This is your fight now, son," his father said, "but you don't fight it alone." Darius swallowed hard, trying to process everything happening around him. "I don't understand." "Not yet," his father said, placing a hand on Darius's shoulder. "But you will, soon." His father turned to the men. "We've got work to do." The men nodded, and one of them stepped forward, offering Darius a hand. "Come on, kid. Time to learn what this is really about." Darius hesitated for only a second before shaking the man's hand. He wasn't sure what he was about to get into, but he knew it had to be done. If there was any chance to change things, to make them see him, to make them see all of them, this was where it started. As they walked inside the warehouse, Darius felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him, but he also felt something else. A spark. The same spark he had felt when he defied the officer on the street. It was the spark of resistance, of standing up. It was the spark of power that came from knowing who you were, even if the world refused to see you. He wasn't sure what this fight would look like. He wasn't sure how it would play out. But he knew one thing. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, forgotten, treated like they didn't matter. This was about giving them a voice. And that was a fight Darius was willing to take on. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, and Darius stepped into the unknown. The battle had begun. The air inside the warehouse was thick with dust and uncertainty. The large steel beams above were rusted, and the floor was covered with decades of grime. The men who had greeted them at the door stood in clusters, talking in hushed tones, their faces serious. Darius didn't know any of them by name, but they all had the same hardened expression, the look of people who had been through hell and had come out the other side scarred but stronger. He could feel the weight of their gaze as they sized him up, sizing up the son of the man who had defied the very system they were all up against. His father led him further into the warehouse, his movements deliberate, confident, as if he had walked this ground 1,000 times. Darius followed quietly, trying to absorb everything, trying to make sense of what was happening. He didn't want to be here, not really. The weight of what his father was asking him to do was too heavy, too dangerous. But at the same time, he knew his father had given him no choice. He had walked through a world that tried to break him, tried to break all of them, and had come out the other side. Now, his father was handing that legacy over to him, telling him that the fight had to continue, that the system could never be allowed to stand without challenge. The soft hum of voices around him, the clinking of metal, the shuffle of feet, all of it seemed to press in on him. It felt like the air itself was thick with history, with years of anger and pain that had been suppressed, buried, ignored. The men in this room had been silenced in every way imaginable, but not anymore. Darius felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't the fire of youthful rebellion or a thirst for justice. It was something deeper. It was the understanding that this was bigger than him, bigger than his father. This was about every man and woman who had ever been denied the basic dignity of existence. This was about every person who had been crushed under the weight of a system that had never cared about them. "Listen up," his father's voice rang out, commanding attention, and the room grew quiet. Darius could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that followed his father's words. Every eye turned to him, every ear listened. The weight of it was suffocating. "This kid is your responsibility now," his father continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "He's part of this fight. He's going to help us bring the truth to the surface. And if you've got any doubts about that, you can leave. But if you're staying, then you're with us. You're with him." Darius swallowed hard. The room was silent again, and for a second, he thought he might choke on the pressure. His father's words echoed through him, each syllable digging into his chest. He was part of this. He was already in it. There was no going back. A man at the front of the room stepped forward. He was tall, with a shaved head and a look of someone who had been through more than his share of wars, physical, mental, and emotional. His face was a map of scars, some visible, some hidden in the way he carried himself. "You ready, kid?" the man asked, his voice low but edged with something like respect. Darius opened his mouth to speak but found no words. What was he supposed to say? Yes, he was ready to take on the system. Yes, he was ready to fight back against the officers, against the very world that had treated him as less than human for his entire life. He didn't know if he was ready, but there was no turning back now. He nodded, just barely, and the man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it was too tired to be a true one. "All right then, let's begin." The next few hours passed in a blur. Darius was introduced to the rest of the men in the warehouse, each one carrying their own story, their own scars, their own reasons for being here. Some of them had been arrested. Some of them had lost family members to the same police force that had humiliated Darius only days before. Some had seen things that no one should ever have to see. They were all different, but they were united by a single thread, a shared rage, a shared hunger for justice. And through it all, Darius sat in the corner, watching. He didn't speak much. He wasn't sure he could, but he listened. He listened to the stories of what had been done to them, to their families. He listened to the plans being made, the strategies being formed. He heard the quiet vows of vengeance, the promises of change. Darius didn't know what he had expected when his father brought him here, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the quiet, focused intensity of these men. It wasn't the sense of purpose that filled the room, the knowledge that something was about to shift, something was about to change. But there was also fear. Fear that it might not change. Fear that the fight would be too much, too dangerous, too far-reaching. He knew what this fight could cost. He had seen the way the world operated, the way the system tore down anyone who dared to challenge it. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had been stripped of their dignity, who had been told they didn't matter. This was about standing up for a truth that had been buried for too long. "Darius." His father's voice cut through his thoughts. Darius looked up, startled. His father was standing in front of him, his expression unreadable. The room had quieted once again, and all eyes were on him. His father's hand extended toward him, an invitation to join the others. "Come on, it's time to start." Darius swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was about to take a step that would change everything. He had to make the choice. He could leave. He could walk out of the room, back to the safety of his quiet, small life. But that wasn't an option. Not anymore. He took his father's hand. They walked to the center of the room, and the men began to gather around them. The air was thick with expectation. Darius could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but this time, it didn't make him shrink. This time, it made him stand taller. The room was filled with stories of pain, of loss, of violence, but it was also filled with something more, something Darius hadn't expected. Hope. His father stood beside him, his presence solid and unmovable. "You see this, son?" he said quietly. "This is what we've been fighting for. This is where we make our stand." The words were simple, but they carried an immense weight. Darius looked around the room again, seeing the faces of the men who had fought, who had suffered, who had lost everything, and still had the courage to keep going. They were all there, standing beside him now, ready to fight with him, and for the first time in his life, Darius felt the full force of what it meant to stand up. He felt the weight of the fight, but he also felt the power of those who stood with him. He wasn't alone. "What do we do now?" Darius asked, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "We show them we're not afraid," his father replied, his voice firm. "We take what's ours, Darius. We take it back. And we don't stop until they see us for who we are." The men in the room nodded, their faces hard with determination. They were ready, ready to fight, ready to be seen. And Darius, for the first time, felt like he was ready too. The battle had begun. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling quiet. The city, the streets, even the air felt like it was holding its breath. Every step Darius took, Every word his father spoke seemed to have ripples, unseen forces gathering beneath the surface. What his father had initiated in that cold, grim warehouse was not just a movement, but a challenge to everything that had held them down. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about taking the world's apathy and indifference and shoving it back in its face. Darius could feel the tension building, the quiet waiting for something, anything, to explode. The men in the warehouse weren't just there to talk. They weren't just there to share stories or grievances. They were preparing for something that could change everything. And Darius wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew that leaving now wasn't an option. Every day, his father taught him more. About the system, about the power that had shaped their lives, and the power they were about to take back. But there was something his father hadn't prepared him for. Something far darker than any lesson, more sinister than any battle he could have imagined. It was late one night when Darius finally understood the depth of the fight they were about to face. He had been in his room, alone, trying to focus on the strategy his father had gone over with him earlier that evening. But the words didn't sit right with him. The tension in the air felt like it was about to snap. The sound of a knock at his door startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. He opened it to find his father standing there, his face hard, unreadable. "Get dressed," his father said, his tone low but firm. Darius didn't ask questions. He could feel it. He could feel the weight in the air, the sense that things were moving faster than he was prepared for. He pulled on his jacket and followed his father out into the night. The streets were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of cars, the occasional voices from open windows, the clatter of something falling in the alleyways, all of it was absent. It was as though the city itself knew something was coming, and it was waiting for it to happen. They walked for what felt like an eternity, passing through familiar streets that now seemed unfamiliar, as though the very ground beneath them had shifted. They turned down an alley Darius had never seen before, one that led into the heart of a section of the city he knew was dangerous. This was the part of town where nothing was as it seemed. The buildings were old, their walls covered in graffiti, their windows either boarded up or shattered. The air smelled of decay, of lost opportunities, of things that had been discarded and left to rot. His father didn't say a word as they walked, but Darius could feel the shift. The sense of danger, of something much more dangerous than any officer, any confrontation with the law, was drawing nearer. They reached a door at the end of the alley, a small, nondescript building, barely noticeable against the shadowed background of the city. His father knocked twice, and after a moment, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his face. His eyes were cold, calculating. There was no warmth, no friendliness in his expression. He looked at Darius, and then to his father, his gaze narrowing slightly. "You're late," the man said, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in days. "I know," his father replied, his tone sharp but calm. "We had some things to sort out." The man nodded and stepped aside, letting them into the building. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and old furniture. There were no windows, just walls covered in maps, papers, and various signs of a makeshift operation. Darius's eyes darted around, trying to process everything. There were men sitting around tables, talking in hushed voices. Some were flipping through files, others were on their phones, while a few were practicing drills in the corner. The atmosphere was tense, charged with something that Darius couldn't quite put his finger on. One of the men at a table looked up as they entered, his face dark and scarred. "What's the kid doing here?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "He's here because this is his fight too," his father said, his voice firm. "What we're doing, this movement, it's about everyone. But it's also about him. The system needs to see him. They need to see all of us." The man grunted, clearly unconvinced, but said nothing more. Darius could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their judgment, their silent scrutiny. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't one of these men who had lived through things Darius couldn't even imagine. These were hardened individuals, men who had taken on the system and survived. Darius swallowed hard, but his father was right. This was his fight too. He had to do his part, even if he didn't fully understand it. Hours passed, and the planning continued. Darius wasn't sure what they were planning exactly, but he knew it was big, too big to be contained in this small room. The conversations swirled around him, talk of protests, confrontations, movements on a larger scale. They were all part of something, a larger push to disrupt the system, to make a statement that could not be ignored. But as the night wore on, Darius began to notice something more disturbing. The talk wasn't just about getting attention or making a change. It was about intimidation. It was about force. These men weren't just fighting to be heard. They were fighting to destroy everything in their path. And Darius realized something. This fight wasn't just against the police. It wasn't just about the officers who had treated him like an object. This fight was against an entire system. A system that had been built on racism, on power, on oppression. And it wasn't just the officers who were to blame. It was the people in power who had created this system, who had allowed it to continue year after year, decade after decade. Darius's stomach churned. The anger in the room was palpable. It wasn't the kind of anger that wanted to change things. It was the kind of anger that wanted to destroy. And Darius wasn't sure that was the answer. As the night wore on, the men began to make their way out of the room, each of them going to prepare for what was to come. His father stood by the door, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this, Darius," his father said, his voice low, almost soft. "You don't have to be a part of this." Darius looked up at him, searching his father's face for any sign of uncertainty, any crack in the hard exterior. But there was none. His father's eyes were filled with resolve, but there was something else too. Something deeper. "I don't know what's right anymore, Dad," Darius said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. "I don't know what the right way is." His father didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he walked over to Darius and placed a hand on his shoulder. "There is no right way, son," he said quietly. "There's only the way we make." Darius swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words settling over him. There was no going back now. This was the fight that had to happen, the fight that had been long overdue. And Darius realized, with a sick feeling in his gut, that the enemy they were fighting wasn't just the officers, the system, or the people who had oppressed them. The enemy was everything they had been taught to believe. The enemy was the silence, the complicity, the thing that had kept them all in chains, and that enemy had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. As they stepped back into the alley, Darius took one last look at the building. He didn't know if this was the right thing to do, but he knew it was the only thing left to do. And with that, he followed his father back into the night, stepping into a battle that would define everything. The world was about to see them for who they were, and Darius would make sure it didn't forget them. The world was shifting, slowly but with terrifying certainty. Darius could feel the tension in the streets, in the air, like a storm just before it unleashed its fury. Everywhere he went, people were talking in hushed voices, whispers of plans, of actions, of things that were happening outside of their control, began to permeate every corner of the city. It was like a pressure building up behind a dam, one that was finally on the verge of bursting. It had been weeks since the night in the warehouse, and Darius was still trying to come to terms with the magnitude of what had happened. The men who had been part of his father's circle were becoming more brazen, more outspoken. The small, quiet meetings had grown into full-fledged operations, each step carefully calculated, each move calculated with a precision that made Darius uncomfortable. It wasn't just about making a stand anymore. It was about a war that was slowly becoming inevitable. Every day, his father spoke of the movement. He spoke of the need for change, the necessity of revolution. Darius had heard it all before, but now it felt different. It felt more real. The anger that had fueled the warehouse meetings was no longer just anger. It was the kind of rage that was unstoppable once it had been unleashed. But with every passing day, Darius felt his own personal doubts growing. The path they were walking was dangerous. not just for them, but for the entire neighborhood. He had seen how the cops patrolled the streets with a silent menace, like they were waiting for something to happen. Every corner was a reminder of how much they had been overlooked, pushed down, denied. But now that the pushback was beginning, the system wouldn't just sit back and take it, and neither would the people. It was a Friday afternoon when everything changed. The day had started like any other, the streets buzzing with the usual mix of people coming and going. Darius had spent the morning working with his father, going over the plans for the next steps, the movements they needed to make to get the attention of the police and the media. But by the time the afternoon sun began to set, Darius had a sick feeling in his stomach, like something was about to go wrong. His father had gathered the men from the warehouse again, and this time, the meeting was even more intense. There were fewer smiles, fewer nods of agreement. People were on edge, their eyes darting to the windows, to the corners, watching for something. What, exactly? Darius couldn't say, but he knew they were preparing for something bigger than any protest or march they had ever staged, and Darius wasn't sure he was ready for it. His father stood at the front of the room, his face grim, his voice low but resolute. "We've been patient," he said, "but we can't wait anymore. The system is too far gone. If we keep playing by their rules, we'll never change anything. We need to take it. We need to show them that we're not afraid." Darius's heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. He had heard them before, heard them in the plans, in the whispers, but now, hearing them out loud, in the cold, concrete room, they took on a different meaning. This wasn't just about standing up. This was about making sure the world understood. This was about breaking the rules, about pushing everything past the point of no return. His father continued, his voice steady, cutting through the thick air. "This is it. The time for asking is over. We will make them listen, and we won't stop until they do." Darius's head swam. He could feel the weight of the room's collective expectation on him. The eyes of the men who had lost everything, who had been beaten, bruised, and silenced, burning into him. They weren't looking at him like a kid in a wheelchair anymore. They weren't seeing him like they used to, weak, vulnerable, easy to overlook. Now, they were seeing him as part of something bigger, but Darius wasn't sure he was ready to embrace that role. "What do you want me to do?" he finally managed to say, his voice sounding smaller than he wanted it to be. His father looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he spoke. "We need you to help lead the march. We need to send a message that can't be ignored. That means we have to be loud. We have to make them see us." Darius opened his mouth to protest, but his father cut him off with a hard glance. "You're not just the son of a man who's been fighting this battle for years, Darius. You are the future of it. The world has to see you for what you are, not for what they've told you to be." The words hit Darius like a slap, a wake-up call that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just some bystander anymore. He wasn't some kid in a chair. He was a part of this fight, whether he liked it or not. And no matter how many times he tried to convince himself he wasn't ready, no matter how much he wanted to hide behind the safety of the status quo, this was his battle too. It was his fight now. The march began just after sunset. The streets were packed with people who had lived their whole lives under the shadow of an unjust system, people who had felt the sting of racism, the humiliation of being invisible. As they gathered in the square, the crowd grew thicker, louder, the energy building like a tidal wave. There were no longer whispers in the corners, no more uncertainty. Everyone had made up their minds. Darius rolled to the front of the crowd, his heart racing. His father was beside him, his presence steady, but even he couldn't hide the sense of urgency in his movements. The men from the warehouse were scattered throughout the crowd, making sure everything was in place. The energy was electric, a raw, palpable force that surged through the group. But Darius could feel the weight of it, the pressure building. He had never been part of something this big, this dangerous. And then it happened. A single officer on a motorcycle sped through the crowd, a clear signal that the law was about to intervene. He was followed by another, and then another. The sound of sirens cut through the air like a knife. The crowd shifted uneasily, the tension rising like smoke. Darius's eyes darted toward his father, who was already moving toward the front of the crowd, his face hard. "Stay with me," his father said, his voice low but commanding. "This is what we've been waiting for." But Darius wasn't so sure. The sight of the officers, the way they circled the crowd like vultures, ready to swoop in and make arrests, filled him with a rising sense of dread. His hands trembled slightly on the wheels of his chair, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. Not now. The first officer approached, his face cold, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. He was looking for someone to make an example of, and Darius knew it. He could feel the heat of the officer's gaze on him, like a spotlight that had been turned on him without warning. "Step aside," the officer said, his voice sharp, dismissive. Darius's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen this before, the way the system tried to silence people like him, the way they made sure he knew his place. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to be intimidated. "I'm not moving," Darius said, his voice steady, but there was a tremor of fear underneath. The officer sneered at him. "You don't have a choice, kid." Darius's mind raced. He couldn't move, not with his chair, not with the officers so close. But he knew one thing. This was it. This was the moment. If he stepped back now, if he allowed them to treat him like nothing again, everything they had fought for would be for nothing. "Not today," Darius said, more confidently this time, his words ringing out through the crowd. The officer's face twisted in fury, but before he could make a move, his radio crackled and a voice called out from the comms. "Hold your position," it said. "We've got bigger problems." The officer hesitated, his gaze flicking between Darius and the crowd, before he turned and moved away, leaving Darius in the center of the storm. For a moment, the world stood still. The air was thick with uncertainty, but also with the kind of quiet victory that came when you refused to back down. And in that moment, Darius knew something. He knew that no matter how hard they tried, no matter how many times they tried to break him, they couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't make him feel small. He was part of this fight, and it wasn't going to stop until the world had no choice but to see him. The fight was far from over, but they had taken the first step, and that step was enough. The days that followed felt like a blur, a constant cycle of rising tensions, mounting pressures, and unspeakable risks. Darius had never known a world like this. He had spent his life trying to live in the shadows, trying to blend in, to survive. But now, there was no more hiding. There was no more pretending that everything would get better on its own, that someone else would step in to fight the battles. The march had been a turning point. The police had pulled back, but Darius knew that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and the world had noticed. News outlets covered the protests, some supportive, some critical. But the one thing they couldn't ignore was the image of Darius, sitting in his wheelchair, standing tall in front of the officers. The streets had been alive with anger, but they were also alive with something else, hope. For the first time, people had felt that something real was happening. They had seen the courage in Darius, in his father, and in the men who had gathered together to make their voices heard. And for a fleeting moment, Darius believed that change was possible. But the reality of what they were up against was never far from his mind. And the next week was a blur of late nights, endless meetings, and secret plans. Darius's father, who had always been the calm center of the storm, was increasingly distant, his mind consumed with the operations ahead. The city was on the brink of something massive, but Darius could feel the tension in his father's movements, the deep, unspoken weight he carried. "Dad, what's really going on?" Darius asked one night, his voice breaking through the silence in their apartment. His father didn't answer right away, as if the question itself was something too heavy to bear. Darius's heart beat faster. He could see it in his father's eyes, the worry, the uncertainty that had been creeping in over the past few days. "We're ready," his father finally said, but there was no conviction in his voice, only a cold edge. "But you need to understand something, son. What we're about to do, it won't just change things. It could destroy everything we've built. The words hit Darius like a punch to the stomach. He had known the fight was dangerous, but he hadn't fully understood the gravity of it. He hadn't realized how high the stakes were. This wasn't just about standing up to the system. This wasn't just about making a statement. This was about taking everything they had fought for and risking it all in a single moment. Darius's stomach turned. What happens if we lose? His father didn't look at him. Then we lose everything. But if we don't do this, we lose our dignity. We lose ourselves. The silence between them felt suffocating. Darius had never seen his father like this. Vulnerable, exposed. The man who had always been his rock, his foundation, was now just another person walking this dangerous path, unsure of what would come next. But Darius knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. The plan was simple, at least on the surface. They would strike at the heart of the city, targeting a police station that had long been the epicenter of brutality and corruption. The officers there had been responsible for countless acts of violence, and now they would face the consequences. But what began as a protest, a demand for justice, quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. Darius had never been part of anything like this before. He had seen his father lead protests, had witnessed the fury of a people who were fed up. But this was different. The plan wasn't just about speaking out anymore. It was about sending a message that could not be ignored. The night before the operation, Darius couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the city outside, the steady rhythm of traffic, the occasional siren. But the sounds of the city felt like they were from another world, another life. In that moment, all he could hear was his own heartbeat, the rhythm of uncertainty, of fear. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity now. He was fighting for every person who had been oppressed, every person who had been silenced, every person who had been told they didn't matter. But what if it wasn't enough? What if this wasn't the way to make things change? The doubts gnawed at him, but then he thought of the people, the faces that had come to him during the marches, the people who had looked at him not with pity, but with admiration. He thought of his father, who had given everything to this fight, and he knew that this was bigger than any fear, bigger than any doubt. He had to do this. For them. For all of them. The night of the operation arrived quickly. Darius wheeled himself into the alleyway behind the police station, his mind sharp, his body tense. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that signaled that something was about to break. The others were already in position, their faces set with determination. "This is it, son," his father said, his voice low but full of strength. "When we make our move, it's all in. There's no turning back." Darius nodded. His hands were clammy, but he clenched them around the wheels of his chair. There was no turning back, not anymore. This was their chance to send a message. A quiet murmur ran through the group as they began to move, like a collective breath held by everyone in the crowd. The officers inside the building hadn't noticed them yet, hadn't felt the weight of the storm that was about to hit them. Darius could feel the heat in the air, the anticipation, but there was something else too, a deep, palpable fear. It wasn't just the fear of what would happen if they failed. It was the fear of what would happen if they succeeded. The police would respond. They would retaliate, and the whole city would feel it. Darius's mind raced, but the plan was clear, and they followed it with precision. They reached the gates of the station. His father was first, his voice commanding, his body filled with purpose. "We're here to take back what's ours," he shouted, and the crowd echoed the words, a roar that echoed down the streets. "We will not be silenced." The officers inside the station began to stir. Darius could hear their footsteps, their hurried movements, but there was no turning back now. The doors were locked, but that wouldn't stop them. The movement was unstoppable, and they had come too far to turn back. And then, in the distance, he saw them. The squad cars, the officers rushing toward them, weapons drawn. His father turned to him, his expression hard and resolute. "This is it, son. Stand strong." But as the officers came closer, Darius saw something else. The people, the crowd, the very people they were fighting for, were backing away. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. And for a moment, Darius felt his heart drop. Were they about to abandon the fight? Were they too scared to stand beside him, beside his father, to face the consequences of this revolution? But as Darius glanced around, he saw something else. He saw people standing tall, facing down the approaching officers, their faces filled with the same determination that had fueled the movement from the very beginning. He saw his father's eyes locked on him, his expression filled with an emotion Darius could barely comprehend. Pride. The line between fear and bravery was razor thin. But in that moment, Darius understood. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had been oppressed, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. This wasn't just a fight. This was a declaration. The officers charged, and the world exploded into chaos. Sirens screamed through the air, voices rose in defiance, and Darius felt himself pulled into the fray. But through it all, he stood tall, because they had made a choice. They had chosen to be seen. The world wasn't ready for the change they were bringing, but it would have to listen. It would have no choice but to see them. And that, Darius realized, was the true power of standing up. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in his life, he felt the full force of what it meant to take a stand. And he knew deep down that the world was never going to be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Darius's journey and the struggles he faced? Have you experienced racism in your own life or witnessed moments that resonate with the themes in this story? Your opinions are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you who takes the time to engage with us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. It means a lot to us and helps us continue sharing stories that matter. We wish you a wonderful day ahead. Please leave a comment with a phrase that reflects the theme of this story, so we know you've listened all the way through. Your voice matters, and we're excited to hear from you.